we'll do the way I'm kind of thinking about it today is like, first of all, this is just very casual. Just a chance to talk about the book and share, and it's very collaborative. Won't be a lecture or anything like that. Like I'll do some um, brief, like shared context type stuff, like to just give a little bit of who Leopold was and the time frame, and but really it's just a chance for us to like talk about an interesting thing and go from there. So we'll do intros. I'll give a brief overview, be a discussion. Share personal stories or connections. Contribute as much or as little as you'd like. Again, there's no test at the end or anything. This is just for fun, to get to know each other and have fun with something interesting. And so maybe I'll go first on the introductions, just to kind of set the tone a little bit, and then love to just for this smaller group, I think we should just go around, so everyone kind of knows where we're all starting from. So Grant Mulligan, calling from my basement office in Golden, Colorado, on my solo night without the kids. Scheduled this months in advance so we could be able to do this. Um, you can find my writing at grantmulligan.com and GT Mulligan on Twitter if you guys want to put where to find each other. I know Robert has a great Substack, put it in the chat, so or your LinkedIn, whatever the best way to get in contact after this is. But why I'm here is this is one of my all-time favorite books. It's deeply personal to me. I'll get into that a little bit more, but it's also I've been really struggling to reconcile progress and environmentalism. I was a Roots of Progress fellow last year. I think a lot about progress. I think a lot about environmentalism, and I'm struggling to kind of reconcile it. I don't have a lot of great answers. So I wanted to revisit, this kind of seminal book for insights. And I'm looking forward to you all helping me think it through. So with that, maybe I'll just go and kind of order on my screen. Robert, why don't you go next?
Sure. Um, I'm calling from Brooklyn, and as Grant mentioned, I write a Substack on about birds and history in the United States, and I'll drop that link as well. I've read uh, Sand County Almanac once before, about 4 years ago, and loved it. I mean, it was a real revelation. So I was really happy to have the chance to read this again. I think there's a lot of really powerful ideas in there, and I mean, it's we need the message as much now as ever. So yeah, excited to get into it.
Anybody in particular should go next?
Brendan, go for it.
Sure. I'm Brendan, Grant's brother, calling from Los Angeles. I don't write online, but I make video games for a living. I had never read the book before and really enjoyed that. Also, because I knew Grant loved it, so I feel now to have a better understanding of my brother, which is super fun. And I particularly enjoyed, I went camping last weekend and just like sat in the woods and read it in the woods, which felt like the right way to do it. And I've been really enjoying it. Yeah, it's not the type of thing I normally read, but definitely helped me feel like more of a kinship for Grant.
Hey, Michael, welcome. Mike and I used to work together, so I just basically got all my friends here. I gave him this book as a gift when we were working together about 2 years ago in New York, after he invited me on something. So,
Autographed
Mike,
copy.
what's that?
Raise your hand if you have one.
Yeah, we're going around just doing introductions. We've heard from Robert and Brendan. Nikki will go next, and then Mike, you can go after that.
Sure.
Cool. Yes, I'm Nikki Britt. I'm calling from my basement office in Denver, Colorado, not too far away from Grant's basement office in Golden, Colorado. It's kind of barren right now. I just moved into this new part of my house. So hopefully if we do this again, it will look a little bit nicer in the background at that point. I also work in video games, as does Brendan. I manage a studio in Boulder, Colorado. Um, and I've never read this book before, but I'm part of the reason why Grant and I got connected through Brendan in the first place is because we were both fans of plants and birds, effectively, and so it was an easy connection when we first hung out. So I was really excited when I started reading it. I found myself almost like I can get into it a bit more later, but I found myself like getting into like a trance as I read. It was like it's kind of like beautiful like sequence of like never ending easy to kind of flow prose, almost like I was like lost in like a rap song or something like that. And there was like pages were just like going by, and I was like, this is just so well written. But yeah, I'm really pleased with the book and the writing, and yeah, a lot of to your point, Robert, a lot of really cool messages and in it that I'm excited to talk about more.
Mike.
As Grant said, we worked and collaborated together for, gosh, what was that, like 2 years? 7? I don't know. Could have been anything. I also so we forged a great bond and friendship, and Grant, just through our conversation, said this was kind of the book that got him started down his path. So of course I wanted to read it right then, kind of after we spoke, and he gave it to me, and I still have not because I haven't gotten around to it, just being fully transparent. So I'm interested to hear everybody's takeaways that was able to read it. And obviously, Grant mentioned it, but I have not heard him talk about it as, kind of from citing passages and stuff. Also got to briefly meet Brendan, his brother, over Zoom meetings, and he talked to one of my kids, trying to help him in the programming space. So the Mulligan family continues to help the Bradys. So I appreciate that.
And Trey, I don't think you're here. If you are, just feel free to come off mute at any time and give your introduction. But yeah, just really stoked for everyone to be here. Thanks. It's kind of fun. This is my first salon. I'm a nobody online as far as that goes. So it's fun to like just recruit my friends and be like, let's read this together and let's do this. And a very smart group here, but all with kind of very different interests has already come through and kind of exposure to the book. And so really excited that we're going to have this discussion today. So I think maybe what I'll do is kind of keeping some of your comments in mind, just give a quick overview of Leopold and kind of this book and why I think it's worth, bringing people together to discuss. So first, Leopold was just a fascinating guy. I think he would have been an inner intellect member. He loved nature, obviously, but was also a big fan of the arts, and just very interesting person. There's a Leopold bench, like architecture of a bench that he built out of plywood that you can see all over the world. He's just a very kind of interesting person who had a lot of hobbies and interests. And he and I actually went to the same grad school, the Yale School of Forestry. And the Yale School of Forestry was created at the turn of the 20th century by it was founded by Gifford Pinchot, the first head of the National Forest Service, under Teddy Roosevelt. Literally, the school was created to make foresters to go work for this brand new thing called the National Forest Service. It did not exist. And if you needed people to work there, you needed actual foresters, you had to train them. So that's kind of how the school got started. And that's where Leopold ended up going to school in the early 1900s. And so the question of like, how do you manage America's land was just very new. And it's kind of important to note that at this point, the thinking, as I'm sure came through in the book, at least in part, is that land is really managed for a crop. Even a forest at that time was just a forest was a crop. It was a timber crop. And so the National Forest is still in the Department of Agriculture in the U.S. as opposed to say the Department of the Interior, like the National Park Service. So they were thought of almost from the beginning. The National Forest Service was thought of as kind of how do you manage things like timber, cropped agriculture, and in the case of a lot of the hunting discussion in the book, how do you manage game so that people can go out and hunt game. And so that's what you kind of get at from thinking like a mountain. He's working for which is the essay about shooting the wolf and watching the green fire go out of the wolf's eye. And that's him as a forester struggling with this type of predator control, creating game, removing predators so there's more deer, so there's more deer for hunters, and kind of struggling with what this all means and realizing that maybe as a management plan, this isn't the way to go. Um, he's a true groundbreaker. So he's credited with getting the first wilderness area designated in the national forest, set aside no roads, special protections. You can hike in, but the idea is to kind of leave no trace. Humans may enter, but kind of not remain. He was the first professor of game management in the U.S. So the nation had never had a professor of game management. He became the first at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he literally wrote the first textbook on the subject, Game Management by Aldo Leopold, all about how you manage game and the science of it. And so the early sketches from the book, that January to December, is him on his land in Baraboo or Portal, Wisconsin, about an hour north of Madison, where his family would go on the weekends. So here's a professor doing this game management, really involved in kind of the shaping of these things, but also have his own private restoration project and thing he's doing. And A Sand County is not the official name of the county, but it was called that because the land was so degraded. And you can actually go visit this farm, this shack that he was in. I've been there with my grandfather, and you can actually go walk the land, and the land is sandy the closer you get to the Wisconsin River because it was so degraded. And so he and his family planted tens of thousands of trees to kind of reforest that area. And now it's lush and beautiful, but he really was, a professor of these things, but also grappling with it in his own day-to-day life in those sketches that you read about. Highly recommend a visit if you ever get the chance. It's very, very neat. And so what you're getting in this book is really a mix of his personal and professional experiences melded together, kind of him trying to reconcile how he thinks about nature and progress and all of these different things together. It was published posthumously in 1949. He had died just at I think it was a week after he found out that it was going to get published. He passed away from a heart attack fighting a fire on his neighbor's land. And so he never got to see it published. It wasn't like instantaneously this bestseller. But after Silent Spring by Rachel Carson was published in the 60s, and the environmental movement was really getting off the ground, his writing, you can see how poetic it was. Kelby, you mentioned how beautiful it is, like really caught the attention and was the kind of introduction in many ways of this ecological concept and nature as a community to the broader public. So, why read it? One, it's gorgeous. Second, it shaped environmental history, kind of like we were talking about. It's kind of hard to understand environmentalism, I think, and some of the core concepts without this book. I think it's so foundational. And then third, I think it's really timely. And we haven't really gotten past this tension that he comes out with right in the foreword, like within the first 3 paragraphs of the book. He's like, should we have progress? Are we getting diminishing returns from progress versus nature? And so this is a question that keeps coming up. And then maybe just lastly, to kind of open up the sharing a little bit, and then I want to hear from you all and just like what you thought, and just let you jump in with wherever you want to go, or if anybody has any context questions, happy to answer those first. But I first read this book in 2005, and I'm looking for my copy here. It's this was the copy that was given to me in 2005, and in the very front of it here, I don't know if you can see with the glare of the light, but there's an inscription from my grandfather that says, "Grant, to remind you of the summers in Wisconsin and how nature is a part of us. Love, Grandpa and Grandma. Good luck as you start college and the next stages of your life." August 2005. And I had spent every summer living with them since I was in 4th grade. And I was going off to college, and my grandpa and I were both kind of mourning this loss of what would be our summers together. And I had spent, my favorite thing to do in the summers with them was to fill up the bird feeders and watch the goldfinches and the cardinals and the indigo buntings and these things that we didn't have in Arizona, these bright colors show up at the feeder. And we would go for these long drives out in the country and go visit places like, Aldo Leopold's land. But I didn't know anything about it. He got me this book. I knew nothing about it. Just that it was about Wisconsin. And it was kind of like about our time together, it felt like. And I read it right away in this basement bedroom and absolutely loved it. I thought it was just like the most beautiful thing ever. I just devoured the book. But never, didn't really think anything of it again. And then I was a struggling college student in my 2nd semester, a biochemistry major, hated it, hated being there, was having no fun at all, not getting good grades. And this book I went to the bookstore to buy my 2nd semester book, and there was a whole stack of these books. And it was required reading for this class. I was like, what class would require, this book, this like, about, some nature guy in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin, where my family's from. And so I go to shopping period and I go to the class, and turns out it's an entire class about careers you can have in conservation. Like the whole point is to help you understand how you could work for the National Park Service or National Forest Service or game management or all these different things you could do. So I go to that first class, I go to the counselor's office, I change my major, I get into conservation, and I graduated as a wildlife biologist, worked as a wildlife biologist, worked at the Nature Conservancy doing land conservation, worked with Mike at a wealth management firm leading a lot of our climate and nature investments. Deeply moving, an important part of my life, all kind of from this book given to me by my grandfather and the chance encounter that I had with it at a University of Arizona Tucson bookstore that changed kind of the trajectory of my life. So that's kind of what I'm bringing to the table. Why I'm so passionate about this book and the personal and historical kind of context to it. So happy to answer any questions people have. Otherwise, just love to hear kind of at the start, like, what do you all think, and what do you want to talk about first?
I'm curious. Was your family from that same county?
Not the same county. So my family's from a town called Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, which if you look at a map of Wisconsin, there's a lake kind of on center right side, a long lake that's Lake Winnebago. Fond du Lac means foot of the lake in French, and we're right at the bottom. And then Baraboo is kind of about an hour maybe straight west and kind of central Wisconsin, about an hour north of Madison, if I'm remembering the distances correctly. So not from that area specifically, but so similar. And we spent so much time going to the marshes and doing all these things. So it felt, reading this feels like reading about, where I spent my summers.
So I've got, so in one of your tweets, X posts, whatever you call them now, you put that it's arguably the greatest book on conservation ever written. And so I guess why, having read way more books on conservation than I have, me being, this is my first, like, what is it about this one that you think garners it that sort of praise or that sort of like placement?
Yeah, good question. I think the starting point for me, and Robert, I know you're very well versed in this too, so would love to hear your answer. But for me, I think it's the stickiness of the land ethic. What he's really saying and what he's driving at in a lot of these is we have a responsibility to nature. It has a value that we should not be quick to overlook. And I think that his idea of community, of you do one thing over here affects another thing over there. And we have to be more conscious about the way that we're kind of impacting our environment. And he's writing this at a time, it's not just like today's a modern, like crazy technological change. You think back to his time, phones are becoming a thing, cars are about to become a thing. He's, as the book is getting published, like World War II has gone on, the Great Depression. There's all kinds of technological changes that he's witnessed in his time. He's watching the world rapidly adjust. And so talking about the ways that, hey, you're doing this over here and it's affecting this over here was kind of a novel concept. Like, I don't think the ecological thinking was really there. And then because he did it so poetically and he talked about like a personal responsibility, he has this line in there that's something like, I'm sure I can find it, relatively quickly, but it's the most famous line in the book. I have it in here of, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. Became kind of like an anthem, right? And so as the 1960s are getting kicked off, and there's nuclear power, and there's the push for the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and the Endangered Species Act and all these things, people are starting to think that way for the first time. And because it's so poetic and because the land ethic is so well written and has this kind of calling, it's just very, very sticky of kind of a thought. But Robert, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and I think that there's kind of two things. Like, it's a book on conservation, and it's also nature writing, and like he forwards this, and yeah, kind of like you alluded to at the beginning, like he is multi-talented, like he's had a lot of different careers, and is just like a brilliant guy, and just like very reflective and thoughtful, and so he's able to accomplish like two really incredible things. One is this idea of the land ethic, um, and the other is just a work of prose and thoughtfulness that that we're talking about, um, 70 years after, 75 years after it was published. Um, and there's a lot of, like you were saying about what's the essay like, seeing like a mountain, and his passage on passenger pigeons, that are justifiably famous because he's able to uh, talk about nature in a way that nobody else had done. And so I think it's both of those things. Like he's not just like a philosopher. He's not just like the Peter Singer of land or something like that. Like he's able to show that connection with the land. So yeah, really, really brilliant piece.
Yeah, and
It's
that the thing like a mountain, a fierce green fire became like deeply associated with him. So he has these lines that stick out to people.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was really interesting reading it, not having come from this background, not having done any like intellectual research at all in it, and finding ideas that felt like second nature to me already. And then it's in the foreword, he talks, maybe it's in the foreword, or maybe it's in the chapters that or so, or just after it, it says that there are no courses that in agricultural schools at the time that teach this sort of thing and about the ethic of land and like the land ethic idea or anything about ethics around land conservation. And I I think it's strange that, or maybe I think it's interesting that it just felt like that's not true anymore. Like it somehow has gotten to me. Like I have digested this information secondarily, tertiarily through society, and have some of these ideas kind of like already on like the tip of my tongue and my mind, without ever having done any of this work. And so like one of the questions that I had after I read that section, like, is that not true anymore? Is that inherently not true? Have these ideas become so pervasive that they are taught? I mean, obviously you said that this book was at your school, Grant. Is this something that's like a pervasive idea and thought and concept around conservation that we see now as a predominant sort of like thought philosophy?
My impression is that it's gotten big in the conservation space. Um, I I don't know how far it's gone beyond that. Like I think there has been a lot of, in like fields of like agriculture and like wildlife management, whatever. I think um, they've spread to some degree or another. But I don't know. I think that's like something that I'm kind of curious to um, to dive into as well, is like what it means to like have the land ethic and to kind of like spread it. Like I think he articulates an idea that's very compelling. I think a lot of us probably feel like that idea resonates with us, like to adopt the land ethic. But um and this is something that like I was familiar, like I read this book years ago, and I was kind of familiar with this idea of the land ethic, but like reading um the chapter again and seeing really what he's calling for is like not just like, oh, this is what it means to be ethical in relation to the land. He's saying we need people to adopt this kind of mentality and shame people who don't.
Yeah.
Like I think he uses the word opprobrium. Like it, he's a hunter. He talks a lot about hunting and what it, he references kind of like ethics around hunting and not shooting more than you need. One bullet, one buck, or something like that. And as somebody who writes a lot about like the history of our relationship with birds, like our country's gone from a place where like it was really acceptable for like boys to play target practice with birds in their backyard, and that's something that's just not acceptable anymore. It's also illegal, but I think that the reason that people don't do it is because they know that that's not an ethical thing to do with animals um, that you're kind of surrounded by. And and so I'm kind of like thinking about this corollary where it's like, okay, well, there's this idea of like we've like advanced over the last 100 years um, in our relationship with wildlife. I think as a public, um, have we made that same change with land? And what would that mean? To see people who have private ownership of land, and like I don't know. Leopold talks about like it's not enough for the government to solve this problem. Like this is something that like we need like individuals to adopt this ethic to repair the relationship with land. Um, so like, what does that mean? like what does that mean for us as individuals? What does it mean for a public? Not just to like how do we get to the point where like accepting that this is a relationship that's important for us to have with land is something that like people actually act on.
Yeah, he also talks about like how landowners oftentimes, if you ask them to do anything else with their land, that they're going to stick their hand out with their palm up asking for money for it. And like, so initially when he first started talking about it, I was like, well, obviously you're just going to have to compensate them with some sort of like reparations for not being able to use their land in the way that they otherwise would. And then he brought that up, and I was like, okay. And then he makes it very clear, like it's not. This is a mentality thing. It's not something that we do through governmental force or anything else. I almost think that like part of me thinks that like both kind of have to be true. As I started to think about it more, like you start with like incentivizing people to do it, and then like the behavior becomes something that people talk about. Almost when I think about like recycling. Like recycling cans at my house has like no meaningful effect environmentally, but the mentality of recycling is very, very powerful. And so like by doing it, I'm exercising that idea. And so I always do it. I know that like ultimately it has very little effect on the global like scale of things, but I wonder if the same thing is true of like if you started to find a way to select and give people compensation for saving off parts of their land, it would be a community talking point, in which case we could sort of start to push the idea of the adoption a little bit better. Because like ultimately, like you need to get people who have all this land. Ultimately, most of the time are people who are like, I'm from the Midwest, so everybody that has large slots of lands are like farmers. So like you got all these. I kept thinking about it from a farm perspective. You got these farmers to somehow like stop using their land as a financial tool. Like this seems very, very difficult simply by like um, changing ideas. It definitely wouldn't happen very quickly. Like getting somebody to change their thought and their thinking that way, it'd be a generational changes, right? So that's part of why I thought it maybe had to be both as I started to kind of go through the process in my head of like what are the mechanical ways that we actually achieve this goal. So
Yeah, that's all very good. I want to pause here and let Trey enter the discussion. We haven't didn't get to meet Trey at the beginning. Trey, we did some brief introductions. If you could just tell us who you are, where you're calling from, and kind of what you're hoping to get out of this and why you picked up the book.
I am from Alabama, and I actually grew up on a farm there. And actually, I picked up the book was I had known who he was, and I think I've been familiar with the book for years, but didn't remember the title. And I'm so glad I did. Even if I had to listen to the audio on pretty high speed, um, to bust through it in time, but um, I was able to read. I couldn't listen in to the first part of this, but I was able to read some of it in the transcript. And there was some conversation way back asking about the book and why it was such a great conservationist book. And something I immediately noticed with it is he somehow encapsulates what it means to live on land. I'm not going to count if 100% of your land is, puts food on the table and, you know, uh, you can't see past that. And I respect not being able to see past that and that situation. But to have a relationship with nature where you get to watch nature and enjoy nature and let nature be nature, uh, where, I mean, I'm not going to say it doesn't have to be managed, but well, I am saying it's not something you have to manage. Of course, hunting, there has to be management involved, but you can just watch it. And that's what he did, and that's what he recorded. And I think he shows how, I don't know if fascinating is the right word, but enjoyable um, over time. And just, I don't know, some amazing gift, we've all been given that few people recognize, much less take advantage of. So that should also answer why I'm here. Uh,
I love it. Thanks, Trey. Uh,
To go back to what Nikki was just saying, Grant, I think that's a lot of what the Nature Conservancy does now, right? Like it does incentivize people to take their private land out of traditional economic use and like gives them tax benefits and stuff for putting it into conservation easements.
Yeah, I mean that's part of it. So if you're the Nature Conservancy, they kind of got started, they do many more things now, but they got started as a true land trust. Basically, we want to keep things from being developed, and so they would put what they call a conservation easement on the land, where they would pay the owner to give up some value of the land. So, if you think about, let's say a farm's worth $1 million to make the math easy, where does that, what makes it worth $1 million? Well, it's what you can grow on it, what the net operating income from the farm is. You're basically taking away things that they could do with that land. You're taking away development rights, you're taking away grazing rights, you're taking away something. In return, they do get a tax benefit in most places. That is certainly a big part of it, but I think there's maybe something more than just simply like protecting it and setting it aside that he's getting at. That is in the Nature Conservancy and other things do, and has actually been quite a schism in the environmental community at times. Is like, what does the land ethic really mean? Some people take it, Nikki, you asked how much is it permeated. Some people have taken it, I think, Aldo Leopold even further than he wrote, to be like, nature has just tremendous intrinsic value, and we should protect it for its own right, for no other reason, for these other things. And other people that, some famous cases of the Nature Conservancy and Peter Kariba and others going, actually, what we should really be talking about is the way that nature benefits people. If we want people to care about this, we should talk about the benefit for, water quality that nature provides. We should talk about the food that it puts on the table, the value of a healthy soil to grow more crops, to do these things. And so there's kind of the land ethic kind of gets split in two ways at times, of like valuing the land for its own right, which might be the like, go protect a piece, fragment your land and just give it to nature. And then it can also mean, how are you making sure that like you're not plowing through the bogs and the marshes and these other things that really are serving your farm. You just don't realize it. And we need to give you an awareness of these things so that you don't go plow it, end to end, flat, make it laser flatten it, all those different things. So there's the environmental community, I think, Brendan, to your point, Nikki, to your point, have kind of different views on this, and different people approach that land ethic and what it means in different ways. I'm curious, for people who didn't have like an environmental training specifically, do you feel like the land ethic is something that like people understand today? I read this book and I was like, this is something that people get. I know Brady helps do a sustainability stuff around the office. I know that, a lot of people, especially when I was growing up, talk about turning off the lights, not leaving the water on while you brush your teeth, and some of these other pieces. So I'm curious to hear from folks, kind of, if you think this idea of community, of preserving nature, of respecting nature was something that you grew up with. Trey?
I've never had formal environmental training. Um, though again, growing up on land, you can't help but pick up some things, maybe a lot of things. I think it's evolved over the years, maybe at least the last few decades. Um, whereas I'm trying to think of the story. Uh, Someone was in Russia years ago. Uh, like, I forget, doing some government related thing, but not environmental. So they're out on a boat in this pristine lake in this relatively secluded part of Russia. And he's just like, the guy's telling the story. It's like, it was incredibly gorgeous. It's like, no pollution, no man-made effects. And so it's like they're having this great conversation. And it's like maybe the guy had a beer in his hand and like finishes the beer, just chunks it in the water. And he's just like, dumbstruck. And he's like, I'm sitting there, he's like trying to hide the expressions on his face, and, because he's in a foreign country, and, trying to be respectful and all that. But um, I think that was the way it was here, just decades earlier, in that, and it's still seen in like national state parks, any land with the public, and numerous examples where it's not even considered trash dumps anymore in some places, because it's archaeological digs, because it's so old, you know. Most, I think, from the 60s and 70s, maybe, just from what I've read. And again, that's very limited knowledge. So I think that's developed over time. But I wanted to make another point. Uh, about the land ethic in general, um, is that it seems to me that landowners, as a percentage of the population, tend to want to take care of their land more and are more attuned to that than non-property owners in general. And actually, I may want to reframe that a little bit. Um, is that private landowners like do see value, they or do see the importance. And again, they may not have seen it 50 years ago, but they more almost the vast majority, I think, see it today. But non-landowners may not, even if they do see it as important, they don't necessarily realize the reality of land ownership and stewardship and whatnot. And that disconnect between the two, I think, causes a lot of problems that don't need to be there. Sorry, I didn't mean for that to get ranty at the end, but
No, Trey, I think you bring up actually one of the most important points of all of it. And the way when it hit me per se, it was actually I went to a fund's annual general meeting. Grant had connected me with it, Trailhead Capital, and we're all gathered there as investors, and you're sitting in the room. It's at this beautiful place that's actually a working and experimental farm. And there's just the big screen in the back, and there's just like a huge picture of like 6 inches of soil, basically. And it's just sitting there, and everybody's gathering, and you kind of go in the room. And then the guy, gets up on stage, and he just, kind of points up here, and he says, "This is the most important 6 inches of soil on the planet that encrusts the planet because it supports all life." And, throughout that day, what I continue to realize is just how disconnected modern society is from food preparation, whether you're talking about, kind of animals and hunting, or where strawberries, apple, and yeah, we all go to an apple orchard, or maybe you bring the kids to pick some strawberries, maybe you go fishing one time, but like the infrastructure and like how often you would have to spend your time doing that to actually feed a family sustainably, is staggering. Right. So we've made all these strides, but at the same time, we're like, numbing everyone to end the land and the animal, like all of it. Right. So it's kind of this dichotomy where, to survive, we have to do a lot of these things, but how do we really do it in a sustainable fashion? And, that was what was always fascinating for me in the work that Grant was doing, and always his optimism of, about it, because the technology is helping, awareness is helping. Nick, you talked about the recycling. Like, I'm crazy recycling guy in my house, in my town, on my friends' text chains, and my motto is, if you're not doing something, you're doing nothing, and doing nothing won't solve any problems, right? So it's almost like you got to do the grassroots and the massive, right? And you got to get Archer Daniels, Midland to like change their practice or whatever needs to happen, right? So it's it's a global effort, right? At the end of the day. So sorry to kind of just spout out, but
That's what we're here for. This is like having a conversation over beers, just chatting. I think that to just tie something you two to go together is one of my favorite lines from the Sand County Almanac. Starts one of the chapters, I think March, is there are two spiritual dangers in not owning a farm. One is the danger of supposing that breakfast comes from the grocery, and the other that heat comes from the furnace. And just slightly further down, it says, if one has cut, split, hauled, and piled his own good oak, and let his mind work the while, he will remember much about where the heat comes from, and with a wealth of detail denied to those who spend the weekend in town astride a radiator. And he comes back to this idea over and over of disconnect. And I think it gets to Trey's point too, of like disconnect, who owns the land, who doesn't. in today's day and age, environmentalism is very much left coded, but a lot of the funding comes from your landowners and hunting and fishing licenses, sales. And in Arizona, a huge proportion of the funding for Arizona Game and Fish, for instance, and the conservation programs they have in the state come from people who still do those more traditional, forms of exploring nature. And so there is this kind of disconnect, and it happens in progress too. Like we forget the progress that was necessary to like make energy wildly abundant, and that it has to come from a nuclear plant or a gas plant or a coal plant or renewables, whatever it is. And so you see this over and over, and I think gets to my core theme of the book is just the sense of like awareness. He said over and over and over through the book, he's like, we just aren't paying enough attention. We're not seeing things. And he's almost like trying to guide you in his writing to the seeing a little bit.
I think what I liked about it as an environmental book is that I do think he made an effort to grapple with the realities of why conservation is such a struggle, and almost had a kind of like a knowing resignation that conserving the world in its present state was not possible or even necessarily desirable, but it was more of like the world has already evolved a lot to be the way it currently is. This is not the moment in time we're trying to preserve. We're part of this evolution, but we should probably be a little more thoughtful about the general direction we're pointing it to. And I found his willingness to engage with some of those contradictions to be what made it powerful. The one of those contradictions I really noticed, like I do think a central theme of the book that he opens with and then ends with is this concept of society's alienation from the land, and that like we've essentially evolved past a dependence on it, so that most people are like living in a city, they don't have any idea what the relationship is. And you can see him, I think, even using the pretty writing as a way to kind of close that gap and be like, hey, here's a way to connect with this experience that you'll never have when you're living in your like high-rise building Los Angeles, but like you can engage with the romantic concept of nature through this thing. But then it's interesting because even he's like, yeah, and then you go to a national forest, and there's all these fucking families there, and it's like not even really wilderness anymore. And like, is this really what we're preserving? Is these like clean roads through the forest? Like, does this count? And so it's like he's got this awareness that like, shit, if we let just anybody walk through the woods, I don't get to have my real wilderness anymore. But if you've never walked through the wilderness, you're not going to want to protect the wilderness. So fuck. Like, and then he's got a similar thing of like, I get we do need to feed everybody, and these farmers are going to do this. And like, we created civilization from the wilderness, and that's one of our crowning achievements. Like he explicitly acknowledges that. He's like, so I guess we're probably going to keep doing that, but it sure would be nice if we thought about it in a slightly different way. And I think from there, I think that's like a really healthy basis to then build an argument on top of, actually, because it is more willing to engage with the reality, I think. And then I do like that from there he built onto it a little bit more with like, look, then there's a couple of ways to evaluate how you do this. There's like a really utilitarian way, which is we measure the number of, bushels that, the dollar amount associated with that. There's the more romantic way where something has more of a sense of value just for its own sake. And like, we should have that conversation. But yeah, I thought that's why I thought the book was so well executed, to communicate that many axes of the conversation on top of romantic writing, and having the romantic writing be a means to communicate that. I thought was really effective.
Yeah, right on. I'm only getting to interrupt. I want other people to be able to go, but I want to just say one thing that Brent said and give a little bit more context. I think of Aldo Leopold as like perched between two ages. So he has that story, in the beginning about the oak tree and cutting through the oak tree year after year and what's happening. And you see that in year after year, things are going extinct and we don't know what we're doing. We're just like, manifest destiny, get out west, kill whatever you can kill, chop down whatever you can chop down. In conservation as a term was like we have to conserve the resources, like we're literally running out of them. That's where the idea comes from. Like we're running out of buffalo, we're running out of turkey, we're running out of white pine. Conservation becomes a somewhat outdated term in the 60s, and it becomes much more environmentalism. We're not running out of things so much anymore. We've got national parks, we've got protected areas, we have wilderness coming into the fore, a lot of acts passed on that. The ethic has really changed. It's permeated. You don't just go out and slaughter as much as you can anymore. But that came as a response in Teddy Roosevelt's day in creating the first wildlife refuge ever. He's like famously said, like, do I have the right to declare a wildlife refuge? And it's like, nowhere does it say that he can't. So he's like, I do declare it. And that's like how it got started. And it was because people were killing all these birds to put feathers in their hats. And he's like, we're running out of these birds. We have to protect it. So we go from conservation, like we're running out of the resource, to environmentalism as like we can poison the soils. We can, we can poison the water. Our waterways, the Cuyahoga River, can catch fire. We can have radiation from bombs and these other things that cause all this damage. So he's really at this change point. And Brennan, I think you get right at it. It's like he sees this happening. He's like foreshadowing a little bit this happening and using this language to try and get us to care in new ways and think about that kind of community in different ways. So I just want to add that little bit of history piece there as well. But anybody else want to jump in right away? If not, I have a question for Robert. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was gonna say too, like I do feel some of the contradiction here. Like I think it's great that he does a really great job of like talking about connection to the land and on, like a personal individual level and what it means to like experience that connection um and but I also feel like this is a bit of like I don't know, like, is it like a luxury belief? This idea that, like, okay, so should everyone get a farm? Like, do 300 million Americans like get their 40 acres or whatever, like, or their quarter section or something, so they can kind of like live this fantasy of like land connection? Like, that also would, cause a lot of, everyone living like Aldo Leopold on the land isn't the solution either. And like that also would destroy wilderness. And like wilderness has its own challenges to that idea. But as like an urbanite, I'm a renter. I don't own land. I think a lot of us probably don't own farms. Like, does the extent of our like duty to land end at recycling? Like he answers this. I wish I kind of like highlighted it, but he talks about this idea that like, in his day, the extent of people's, we can say, environmentalism was voting right, joining an organization, and turning the lights off or something like that. And he critiques that idea. And I don't know that he like gives us an alternative model um, for what that would look like. And I mean, that's a question. Like, I don't know what my duty is to the land other than like consuming responsibly and like recycling and stuff. And I think at the beginning we had a bit of this discussion about like, um, like the people who have private ownership of the land, like what, the farmers, like they're the ones whose decisions impact the well-being of the land more than my consumption decisions. Like I'm not actually that powerful in that situation. And so like what would that look like for me, like a renter, to have stake in the land? And we talked a bit about this, or reference the idea of like reparations or something like that. Like, not going to happen, but like a taxation regime that takes my money and puts it towards restoring land, right? Like I feel like that's what stake looks like. I don't know what else, donating to the Nature Conservancy, I guess, would do something similar. But um, for us, for those of us who like use land recreationally to go hunting, to go birding, canoeing, like that's nice. It's nice to consume it, but like that's still like I don't know. I feel like that's not really getting there.
I think
Grant Grant had made a point too, and we can't all spend our time farming because then so to speak, or then nothing else will get done, right? You'll kill productivity, everything crashes, right? There's a balance, and again, unfortunately, I didn't read the book, but from what I'm hearing everyone saying, and Brendan described it very well, like there's this tension and balance, and like what's the right mix? Because you can't have it all one way or the other. Because each one would be disastrous for humanity.
I tried to think about like what is it that I think he's advocating for? Like what changes would he want from kind of any of the individual readers who read it. And there's like a few different arguments I think he makes. On the most practical end, I think one of them is like, we should teach people about this stuff better, right? Like we should have the people who are studying biology should have to learn ecology, not just biology, and they should have to understand the complex systems and how they work together, which I think is a relatively reasonable proposal, and I think probably happened, right? I think like that goes back to we all grow up kind of understanding that we're part of a system, and I don't think that that's a crazy thing to consider anymore. Then he's got his kind of, hey, farmers should farm in such a way as to be multi-generational, right? Like we have done all these, there's all the soil depletion, etc. And again, I think that's a place where we might have just technologied our way out of that hole, right? Like we might have just figured out advanced fertilizer and stuff in a way that it doesn't really matter. And soil, I don't know enough about how that impacts soil erosion and stuff, but like I think it's unclear whether like that particular area worked. And then I think he's got this kind of other philosophical argument that he's making that he seems to be aware is going to be his more lasting contribution, which is like I think you can almost see him trying to like start a religion in a sense of like, if there were enough people who believed in this religion of land, then as these complex decisions continue to get made for the next 100 years, at least more people will be on my side. Like I think that's really the kind of enduring argument he's making, because he doesn't have a ton of like really particular policy prescriptions. And again, he grapples with like, fuck, probably do need more civilization. Like that's probably for good, but there's a risk here. And I think that's part of why he talks about this, like, yeah, there's the utilitarian way of thinking about it, which is like how many trees are on the land, and then there's the systems way of thinking about it. But then he explicitly says, but on top of that, there's this romantic thing. And he over and over, I think he both starts and ends the book with an explicit call to religion, which is, I think it is in the January section, or maybe even the forward, where he's like, man's relationship to land is currently Abrahamic. It's like we own the land. It is a utility of ours to do whatever we want with. And then I think it's very late in the end when he starts to reference the 10 Commandments. And he's like, the 10 Commandments are, not even a thing that were just written by Moses, but they're an evolution of society, and that became the new culture and the new law and the new way of being. And he seems quite good at appreciating that a good religion has like your practical things that you have to do every day. Like you have to like go to church at this time, you do these things, and that's good, the utilitarian stuff. But there's also this romantic notion of like, you need to just believe it and feel it in your heart. And that's what he's really trying to sell, right? Is like these adherents. And he talks a lot about like, I think the heroes of the book, as far as he's named them, are hobbyists, just like the people who, like Robert, like I fucking love birds and I'm going to write a Substack about birds. Like this is going to be my thing, and I'm definitely not getting paid for it, but I do it anyway, right? Like that. He like really, the only time he ever celebrates an individual human in the book is for that behavior, and is like, and by the way, the more you're getting paid for it, the worse it is. Like don't, like you should do it because you love it, and that's like a very religious concept, right? Of like, show your contribution to the church for the faith of it, because you believe and because you're a true believer. And I think that's like fairly compelling art. Like I think it's a pretty cogent approach to birthing a new science, especially when so much of, I think, modern politics is like you're either doing something right or doing something wrong. I think his idea of like, hey, let me lay down some like utilitarian ways of thinking about this and some ideas that we teach people that, but then let me try to like build a church around this. I'll say I think it worked. Like I think that if you look at the last 60 years and the fact that, we're reading the book now, I'm like, he was a good Moses.
I was thinking that in the last passage of the land ethic, he starts talking about the religious stuff you mentioned, Brendan, but he also like slips in this hilarious thing now, looking back on it, where we are in society. He talks about organic farmers being, what is it, bearing some of the earmarks of a cult. And I was like, this is amazing. Like reading this written in like 1949, he probably is like trying to hold on to the reader when he brings up organic farming, because it's like so out there and like wonky. And now at this point in our lives, it's like so suburban and like accepted. Like organic farming is just like a part of like what people want in terms of like a purchased product. And so I found that to be really fascinating, that like you're like, he's trying to make religion, but he's also referring to like these kind of wacky cult people. They say, well, at least they like generally have good ideas and are kind of like thinking about a biotic way. And like, I just found it to be like a really fascinating like moment as he goes into that whole religious thing. But I totally agree that like, yeah, he's like, we need to, ultimately the answer is like, we need to change the way people think. And as I kept thinking about it more and more, like what do we do? Like I kind of be like, what does that mean for us? We're reading this book. What do we do now if we have this information and we have this knowledge and technology? What do we do with that? And like the passage that you brought up earlier, Grant, is that a thing is right when it tends to preserve integrity, stability, and beauty of a biotic community, and it's wrong when it tends to do otherwise. Like it needs better PR, man, and we need to TikTok that. Like that needs like we need to make that more succinct and like digestible, because you say that to like 90% of the population and you've like lost them within like the first 3 words. Like, so part of what goes through my mind is like how do we make it, and kind of back to all the way back when I first started speaking about some stuff earlier, is like I felt like I kind of understood a lot of these ideas, like, and to Brendan's concept earlier, is that like it's kind of permeated like what we think in general, so it seems successful in that way. I I'm also like in a very specific group of people. Like I went to like a very specific grade school where we went camping all the time, and I find myself living, in Denver, Colorado, and go like people going camping a lot, and like the way that we think is like not the same as like the general society at large in the United States or in the world. And so like my perception of having access to these ideas or being like exposed to these ideas, I don't think is actually true of the greater public. And I think that's indicated in like watching people like lay down in like beds of super blooms in California and getting their like Instagram photos or like whatever it might be, right? So I do think there is wrapping back to like I think there is a huge disconnect between a lot of people and these ideas, and I don't think that they are that pervasive at large. I think that I just happen to come from a specific area where like it seems natural to me to know this sort of thing. But yeah, I don't like, my gut is like there needs to be a way that we can communicate this to like other generations that they care about. A part of me thinks that like it's just like as beautiful as the book is, and as much as it connects with people like me, how do we get it better PR? How do we make it more punchy? How do we get these ideas to be trickled through into like larger communities that aren't going to read the book, never will read the book, or are they already these ideas already pervasive enough that they are getting through those communities? I just find it hard to believe that somebody who lives in like inner city Chicago has any idea of what we're talking about right now. Like it's completely irrelevant to them. They've got so many other things to worry about. And like, how do we make that be a part of something that they're educated in as well?
I think there's a lot of good stuff here. I'm going to read very quickly the paragraph that Nikki referenced. The discontent that labels itself organic farming while bearing some of the earmarks of a cult is nevertheless biotic in its direction, particularly in its insistence on the importance of soil, flora, and fauna. And he kind of goes on to talk about kind of government's role in this and a lot of things that I think today we would think are, really prescient. I'll just throw a couple things out here, in response to what you all said is, I think Brendan, you're right about the religion thing, and that he has a very cogent way of doing this, and he's utilitarian, he's understanding of what's happening here, but he's also kind of building religion. I think you've gotten a lot of that in environmentalism. It has really permeated the culture in a lot of ways. I mean, even just like the response to climate change lately is you can see a lot of this of people trying to pay attention to the way that humans impact the planet. Like I think that if you were like, is he successful in the book? Like, does he end up winning on the dimensions that he wants to win on? Not in all of them, but it did result in the Wilderness Act getting passed. It did result in the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and Dangerous People, many of these different things. Like, I think he did win on a lot of these. I think he got people really caring about it and paying attention. I think the question is like, how do you get people in the cities or some of these others to care about it a little bit more? Just like nature for its own right is what I think you're saying, Nikki. I'd be curious to drill down on that more if people are interested. But Robert was on the Odd Lots podcast not that long ago, and their lead-in is all about the owl that escaped from the zoo, and New Yorkers suddenly in Midtown Manhattan getting all excited about this owl that's happening here. And Robert goes on to talk about like how they're trying, how educate the government used to try and educate farmers on this, and what their technical assistance and outreach used to be. It's well worth listening to. Maybe Robert, you could drop the best link in the chat so people can listen to it afterwards. But I think that there's one of like you can kind of take his argument in many ways. I think one of the things that makes the book hard to talk about is he puts out he does so many different things with it. And each essay is kind of making a different argument. So I think in some ways he's saying like, just see the birds. Like you can be in a city and see the birds. You don't have to go to the wilderness area. He's just like, please just pay attention that kind of nature is around you. Think about where things come from. Like at some level, like there's still a ton of work to do on that. But I think he's gotten on the thinking of like the community and things that interact have happened much more. I think where it gets much, much stickier is, does wilderness, as he kind of defines it or thinks about it, like, is man a part of nature or is man a part of nature, apart from nature? Does man go into wilderness, or is like nature all around us and we're a part of it? Like there's a tension in what he's saying that is never fully resolved of what our relationship actually is to that. And today that is still one of the biggest challenges. And so when I think about like, well, what do we have to do? What does it take? I think a big part of it is like it being in the progress community is getting them to think about nature as something that sustains us, like almost as like an ecosystem services. Of like you're tinkering in ways with the environment that you don't fully realize it does so much for us, rather than being like we've evolved so far we can do all these amazing things that don't need nature. I actually think it's a little bit the opposite. Like, well, what would you do to consider nature and progress together so that nature is kind of like returning progress a little bit and progress is returning more nature? And can you get to a third stage of environmentalism that is less about like conservation, we're running out of resources, we're poisoning everything, to like, can we actually restore it now? We can grow so much food per land, and maybe we just forget organic, we go super intense in certain areas, but that allows us to convert the rest, back to nature and do some of those things. But those questions all get really garbled. He never fully answers them, and I think leaves a lot of work for us to do on what is the role of nature. Like, what do we even mean by that term? In a lot of ways, it is a huge part of like how we tell that story. But Robert, you added a bunch of stuff to the chat. Tell us a little bit about what and I think maybe Trey, you did as well. So what are you sharing?
I'm just adding one piece that I think is like should be part of this conversation. Is this? It's something that I think about probably most days. It's an essay called "The Trouble with Wilderness" by William Cronin.
Can I interrupt real quick, Robert? So Bill Cronin is my wife's best friend's father. So I hung out with him at her wedding. But please proceed.
Yeah, wow. I'm like stars. Like speaking of like people, like he invented the field of environmental history. Like it's one of these people that like really shaped, well, personally how I see the world. But he talks about this like the history of the idea of wilderness, this idea, this place that's kind of like set apart from our daily life, that in kind of like the mere Roosevelt tradition, like a place where men go to prove themselves, like after the frontier was closed, like these places where like in Yosemite, you had to move people out of the land to create wilderness, because wilderness actually never existed, and as opposed to like learning to live with the land, because like we need to consume products of the land to survive. And so how do we do that? And also find, he talks about wildness as opposed to wilderness. Like wildness is like the quote that I dropped in there. Like wildness is in the cracks in the sidewalks. And it is and can be everywhere. And so like how do we live with that? How do we like find that where we are? And which is something that Leopold talks about too, is that like that curiosity, that connection can be fostered just as well in a city as as, or it can be absent on a form. So, like one, how do we foster that where we are? But two, how do we also, understand how that we change the land by living on it. We change the land by consuming food, whether it's on a self-sustaining farm with the best practices or through kind of industrial agriculture practices. Like it's all changing the land. So how do we do that in a way that um, preserves the biotic communities that live there?
Yeah, well said. And I'm just going to interrupt here to say that I'm doing a poor job as host. I was paying zero attention to the time that we had allotted, and we are over. I'm happy to stay talking about this until I die here in this chair, because I could do this for forever. But I understand that there's also people on the East Coast who are, it's after 10 o'clock now. So just flagging for people that you're welcome to drop anytime, and maybe if anyone wants to respond to Robert or has something else to add to the, happy to stay and hear it and be part of the conversation. But we'll start getting to the wrap up point here in the next few minutes. And for what it's worth, I think Robert, your point is right on. Of like, there's this real tension. Like, are we a part of it or are we not a part of it? And that William Cronin writes about really eloquently, and it's just really hard to define what that looks like. I go for a walk in nature across the street in my little suburban neighborhood to see great horned owls. That feels like real nature and wild to me. But it's very different than an experience I just had in Yellowstone 2 weeks ago, where for the first time I saw a badger and just got to watch it like catch a squirrel and run off. And they're like, it was me and no one. There were bison, I saw a wolf, I saw two grizzly bears. Like that was wild, right? Like totally different experience, but both are kind of nature, right? And we don't have a great word to separate necessarily what I find in my backyard versus what we find elsewhere, and it creates a lot of tension in the space.
I have a question, Grant. Given your world of environmentalism in progress and the various circles that you've been in that I know have like some more left-leaning connotations, other more right-leaning connotations, some, on other axes, I'm sure. What group do you think Aldo Leopold would best belong to? Like, he doesn't strike me as like a degrowth environmentalist at all. But like, where would you say the modern home of his school of thought is most closely?
Ooh, that's a great question. Oh, that I should like write a blog about that. That's such a hard thing to answer off the top of my head. I'm curious what other people like. We should go around and maybe that's the last thing that for people to kind of weigh in on what they think. In some ways, I think I'm sure people would disagree with me on this. I think he might be very close to Stuart Brand. And I think that's somewhat maybe a controversial take, but I think the "we are as gods." I think part of what he's getting at with a lot of the religious talk, and he has a thing in there about King Tristram and others, is like, you're here, you're gonna make your mark. Like, what kind of mark do you want to make? And I think he's got this like, we might as well get good at it, but that means like really understanding what we're tinkering with. That means preserving every piece of the puzzle, and like, until we know what it does. And Stuart Brand is a very like long-term thinker, right? He's like the Long Now Foundation, trying to get people to think more long term. I think Leopold is getting to some of that, and I'm curious, like, if his
Is
thought
there
was
an
like,
example who was also not born before World War II? Because
it's
I think
just,
that's like the thing these guys have in common, right? Is they're of us the same generation where I think this, they're kind of the original prophets of this religion, right? And now we have what happens in all good religions, like the seventh and eighth generation zealots are, killing each other over minor differences. Like, who are the new prophets? Who's the head priest of the true branch? Like, do you in your world I like interact often with people that you're like, yeah, these guys are like Leopoldians?
I
Or
don't, I don't, I'm not, I don't know that I answer that question. I think like some of the folks at the Breakthrough Institute who are writing who wrote the eco-modernist manifesto, are getting at this a little bit. So that's the Breakthrough Institute, but Stuart Brand was a like assignee to that. I think one of the things that I don't like about that as much is their thing is like we're just going to decouple. We're going to have like progress over here and people over here, and we're going to have nature over here. And what the decoupling allows us to do is like fully separate these things in a way that then preserves nature, and that's great. But we need to build nuclear, and we need to, like very on the progressive side. I think that they're very policy oriented in that way. And so I think certainly part of what they do. I'm trying to think about the people who do it for like the love of it. Robert, I'm wondering if Robert maybe can help me, or if other people have examples. I yeah, it's not maybe one last one. I haven't read the book yet, but like if you go to Barnes and Noble right now, you will be shocked at how many memoirs about birds there are on the shelf. And like really prominent on the like the end of the bookshelves. Like Amy Tan has like a year plus long bestseller all about trying to get away from Trump and all the politics and like reconnecting through birds. And like there are people doing this and talking about this, but the people that come to mind, at least initially for me, are very much more the Gretas and the other people who I think would not identify with Leopold well. I think maybe just one last thought, because I'm kind of rambling and thinking out loud, is there's a whole group of people like at the Nature Conservancy. There's look up the Abundance Conference. There's a group there I was just reading about that's a more kind of like conservative group that's really trying to think about nature and conservation. I think there's like maybe the American Conservation Coalition or something like that. Like there are people doing this, but I can't right now think about it. In my world, I'm actually, spending more time in progress lately, struggling to think about how to get them to care about environmentalism, and like that people care about this. And from almost like a political economy standpoint, you need to take people's just love of nature and seeing birds more seriously in part of the telling of what it does. But I don't know. You've asked an incredible question. I'm gonna have to really think about that. What do others think?
I have a couple. I mean, first, if you're really going to be like, who is Leopoldian today? You're not going to be Leopold if you're not hunting. And so I'm like, who in the environmental movement has that? And that, that's something that I don't really know the big figures, but I am kind of thinking of like writers who like embody that ethic. Um, One that comes to mind is there's a I'm from South Dakota, so this kind of resonated for me, but there's a rancher in South Dakota who decided to kind of like go all in on like bison ranching. He has a book called Buffalo for the Broken Heart, which is really fantastic. And a lot of it is about relationship with the land, and moving away from kind of cattle ranching to bison, like using bison for income, but also for restoring land and restoring connection with original inhabitants of the land. Um, and there's a book that just came out called Sea of Grass. I think I'll drop these books in the chat, but it's about kind of like the history of uh, kind of like how we destroy the Great Plains, and then kind of what restoration efforts look like on the Great Plains, and trying to like restore health of the water and of the soil. Um, Leopold talks about the how like the tall grass prairie is gone, and in all this discussion, I'm kind of like, we can talk about like individual actions, but like, what does it take to bring the tall grass prairie back? And I feel like that's kind of like a threshold of just like, well, if we still don't have that, like what, that we're living in a really impoverished kind of country. So yeah, that's kind of a ramble, but those are two books that I've certainly drawn inspiration from.
No, it's super helpful. I'll add to that, like Ted Turner has been actually very big in the land conservation
Totally.
community on
Yeah.
a lot of that buffalo and other things. The started CNN, billionaire. He took up the mantle for a while. Again, older generation. But there are groups that are like working to restore huge parts of the plains and buy up ranches and do things that allow animals to migrate back and forth. So it's not like an individual action. They're like literally trying to buy up corridors from Yellowstone through the Dakotas and things so these things can migrate. Going, we need something bigger scale. An individual can't really do anything. This is a much bigger problem. But I'll let others jump in.
If I may point to something we were talking about earlier, I put this link in a while ago and then conversation kind of moved on. Um, was a New York Times article about this TikToker from Alabama who um was what was he doing? Clearing a field for to plant it for hunting. Attract deer as most hunters do. And all of a sudden, all these plants popped up, and one thing leads to another, and he discovers that they weren't like endangered, but more rare plants. And he's like, huh, this is interesting. So they'd always been there, and just needed to be cleared to have the chance to reemerge. And so, long story short, he becomes a TikTok influencer because I guess just started talking about it. And he was discovering, all these other lesser known and I'm trying to say rare and endangered, but I don't think it's that level, but maybe some were plants that were growing around or would sprout up if some things were done. And so he talks about how because of his TikTok income, he goes to different landowners and volunteers, lets them know they have it on the land and volunteers to keep it up for them at no charge, because he's like, I do TikTok, get the money there. And I mean, I know we all like to mock TikTok and the bad things, but that's a pretty good thing. And as I was pointing out earlier, I think a lot of landowners, you know, especially when it's not forced, when it's somebody who's just passionate about it, knocks on their door and is like, you have and again, I'm using rare plant, growing, I can help it sustain it, by taking these actions and all this, would you mind? And I would think, and it seems like he's saying this, that most of them are all for it. And that's like, I don't necessarily know I want to encourage that like on a large scale because if the income gets too much, you may attract people that aren't doing it out of passion like him who literally stumbled upon it. You get problems there, but I don't, sounds pretty awesome to me.
That's a great story. Thank you
And
for
a
sharing that.
positive story.
I can't wait to go read that. I love that. The title is In Alabama, a Social Media Influencer Really Gets Wild. Kyle Leibarger built a loyal following online by talking about native plants and why biodiversity matters. What a great story.
I do think, like, to Nikki's question earlier of like, we need TikToks about this. I think this type of thing is very popular already with young people. Like, one, I think everybody loves low cost symbolic gestures to make them feel good about themselves. So like that type of engagement is, I think, super like highly contagious in a meme environment. I didn't mean that as pejoratively as I think it sounded, but like I think it's like that makes for a good,
It
meme in the
wasn't
like
wrong.
in like the Dawkins sense of memes. Like it's good. That makes good meme travel. But also like I think the tools of social media have given a sense of scale to hobbyists now. Like he talks about this hobbyist who had the world's biggest collection of like, seashells or whatever it ended up being, and then the government found out about it. So somebody who wrote a thing about books, and like those people have like Substacks now, or they have like they're like the king of their subreddit, or they have their TikTok that goes viral because everybody loves it when somebody shares a special interest and has this like crazy things. Like I think there's never been a better time to be an obsessive hobbyist in these spaces, and even you see it with things like Moodang, that like the hippo. Like people love cute animals. Cute animals are super shareable. Like that type of thing I think is super popular. So I don't see that as the issue. I think it's more of, to me, I'm almost, what I find, if I had to make an argument for how the world should be different having reading this book, it's actually not that the world should care more about these things. I think the world cares a lot about these things. It's that I wish that modern environmental conversation was as intelligent and thoughtful as this. Like it just felt like this was like much more nuanced and aware of trade-offs and thoughtful, uh and less inherently antagonistic. I think this is maybe written in a time before there was such a stark like red versus blue line drawn in the environmental world, and it allowed him to kind of face both sides of things. And to me, that's the thing I find most missing today.
Man, I think you're totally right. And that is my thing is that environmentalism has always kind of turned me off, even though we've been in it the whole time. Because I'm like, you're so strident, you're not kind of being reasonable. You're doing showy things, but not the practical policy things. And that's a gross generalization. There's a bunch of great stuff people have done, but there is a tendency to do the symbolic gesture. And I think where I see these changes, where I'm really optimistic, to Brennan's point, is like some of the most pragmatic people I know are people I funded when I was doing capital allocation at the wealth management firm. There are people who are like, we can figure out how to make money and do good for nature. Like we can figure out that this land isn't being fully utilized or the farmer hasn't invested the right things, and we can, they may not, a typical farmer may be land rich but cash poor, and they can't invest in, let's say, a solar array on the edge of the farm that allows them to convert all of the water pumps from diesel to electric. The private equity group goes, that's a win. Like that's a win for nature, that's a win for all kinds of things, and we're going to save a bunch of money from volatile fuel costs. And so like there's a really interesting dynamic I see happening now where there are people thinking much, much more about how you do this in a very pragmatic, practical way. That's some of the work I did at the Nature Conservancy and others, like really trying to go, how do you rationalize water use? How do you think about how you get more? I'm all for desalinization and these like big projects, and like let's give some more water back to nature so we're not fighting about like the Delta smelt in California not getting enough water. Like let's just pump enough water up in the top of the stream that everybody gets what they want. Farmers can pull as much as they want and they need, and there's plenty of water left over for the fish. And I think that's where the progress in environmentalism I hope is going, of almost like very active engineers in this. And I see some people doing some really good work, because I do think the goal isn't to get people to just care about nature. I think they care a lot. I think people love elephants, even if they'll never see them in Africa. Like it's there in a lot of ways. I think what's harder is like the big scale changes in the policy and the things you vote for and how you allocate, funds and things of that nature to actually get the work done at a reasonable scale.
I think the tricky thing is like getting people to care about the thing, and he talks about this too, like getting people to care about the bog. Like
Mm.
it's like easy to get people to care about the elephant or whatever, but it's really hard to get people to care about the bog. And the bog is like so much more impactful than a lot of other things we discuss, like not only from carbon capture, but also from like wildlife preservation and like the number of like species that can evolve. Like, and I don't know how to like make that sexy. I don't know how do we attach the sex cells to the bog, Brendan. Like like you came in with like the sex cells on the coming to hang of this chat. Like how do we get the bog people, like that's the thing I get stuck with, is like people are misallocate their what there's the whole like Mr. Beast plants a million trees crap or whatever the hell it was, and like but nobody's talking about the peat bog that like is the actual like true like workhorse, the engine of the planet. And like I don't know, like I don't know how you get people to care about that.
I don't think he cares if the people in the city care about that. And I don't know that I do either. So maybe I'm just projecting. But I think like that's what I think part of what he was saying was the modern man is so separated from all of this. But worse than that, the modern university trained biologist is also separated from this.
Yeah,
and he
sure.
does a ton of that, right? And then he goes, what we really need is we need ecological training, and we need answers to these divides within our own community of what is a tree for. Is it the purely utilitarian thing, that is it a crop, or is it part of a system? Because these are the people who live in that system and who are responsible for stewarding that system, and he's advocating that the stewards of that system do a better job with it. But I think he's relatively indifferent on whether or not the kid in Chicago even knows that exists. I think he's more like, I hope people like that appreciate beauty. I think they'd be better off. He makes some really interesting, like almost like Lee Kuan Yew style arguments for like if the society cares like feels like they own it, they'll care more about it. If you get to experience it, you'll be more patriotic. Like those are interesting philosophical arguments that he makes. But I think that is more for him arguing against a general alienation from nature. And that's less of him, I think, arguing for policy prescription. I think where he wants to see more awareness of like the proper land ethic is in the actual economic stewards of the land, which I think is a different populace with a different set of needs.
I think that's really one quick question I want to ask for people who know better than I do. Like, people who manage land at this point, like, what percentage of them have like an agricultural degree or have gone through like a college program, and how many like I guess my question is like, we've added economic stewardship to higher level education. Let's say that's happened. I don't know if it has or not. It obviously has to some degree. We're talking about it. How many people are actually aware of that, who actually are the owners of these generational farms or maybe modern farmers? Like, how many people are actually even aware of that? Because I feel like where I grew up, most of the people that took over farms, I think they went to ag universities in these small Midwestern schools, but like, I'm not entirely sure, like, would they have gotten this as a part of their curriculum? I have no idea.
I don't know that farmers in industrial farming these days would necessarily be considered ecological experts now.
But would they have been forced to read this in their training, or do they not get, do a lot of these farmers not actually have higher level education training? Are they just like mostly like family passed down knowledge?
No, I think honestly, like large scale industrial farming in the United States is mostly like very wealthy MBAs who own like massive industrial farms. Like there's a level of alienation from the land that is like so extreme that even the industry, in the time he's writing this, it's like you're a farmer and you like plowed your field and you got too close to the barbed wire fence, and there's like he describes the alienation of nature on only the pure consumer side. But I think in the time since he's written this, there's also an alienation even on the production
For sure.
side, which is like we're now running these like factories essentially of food.
I would add to that that I put in the chat to find land managers. I mean, there are professional land managers that most of them, plan to be that, did the degree, and went into the field. Then there are the landowners, which come into the land a variety of ways. Corporate agriculture, which is something really entirely different to a large degree. Uh, but getting back to your question, if you care about it, you don't need a degree. You just need a desire to learn and figure it out. I mean, it's by no means rocket science. It's accessible to anybody who wants it today. So, and I think it's also something that naturally will come to people on their own. I don't want to say time scale, but in their own way. And so it'll just something that'll naturally occur over time. And also it's something that it's not like he had all the answers. And I think the book was published in 49. Maybe I'm a little off there, but he definitely didn't have all the answers then. We definitely didn't have all the answers 50 years ago. And we have more answers today, but still not all. We're still getting better at all of it. And, it may be easy to argue making exponential progress, or on the cusp of it. Maybe I'll say on the cusp of it. It's probably better put. Um, and last thing I also want to point out, actually, Grant was mentioning this earlier about seeing, I think, birds in the backyard. That's nature, obviously. And I made the joke in chat about, coyotes have taken over the suburbs and even urban areas because they just thrive. I mean, if an animal thrives, is that nature? And I would hate to get to a point where we define suburbs as nature. No offense to the suburbanites on here, but um, there's something to be said there. Maybe even the urban areas have something to offer. But again, if the urban areas are so small, my goodness, it's hard to worry about that. But I will add, I definitely don't want urban areas adding to pollution, like the water catching on fire. That's a bit extreme, to say the least. But I mean, we just think about where we've been, what, in the 70s, maybe it was the 80s, into the 80s, with the just disasters of places, to now. I mean, so give us another, what, 40 years, 50 years.
So to connect these things maybe and to start wrapping us up here because we've been an hour and a half now, which I just love. He in one of the last paragraphs of talking about the land ethic, it may be the land ethic specifically. I don't think it is, but I think it's in that section of essays. He says, to sum up, a system of conservation based solely on economic self-interest is hopelessly lopsided. It tends to ignore and thus eventually to eliminate many elements in the land community that lack commercial value, but that are, as far as we know, essential to its healthy functioning. It assumes falsely, I think, that the economic parts of the biotic clock will function without the uneconomic parts. It tends to relegate to government many functions eventually too large, too complex, or too widely dispersed to be performed by the government. An ethical obligation on the part of the private owner is the only visible remedy for these solutions. And I read that one because I think it doesn't matter if it's the government here that he's talking about. If you find land management as, say, National Forest Service, if you define the suburbanite or the ex kind of rural people who live right on the edge of the forest and say Los Angeles that had their homes burned down, but because they're encroaching into this wild area and this complex mesh there. What he's getting at is not just preserving individual things. He's talking about throughout the whole book, he's building towards this idea of the community functioning together. And he gets at this even at the beginning when he's talking, I think it's even in January, he's like, a mouse doesn't, is free from want and fear in these conditions, and a hawk is free from want and fear. He's talking about the cycles and the communities, the way these things are all interconnected. And I think the challenge here is in protecting the bogs, protecting the meadows, it's getting people to do things like prescribe burns or forest thinning, or like ideally like returning mammals, Thule elk to the parts of California with grassland. So you have actual rangeland animals that keep the range in check. So you don't have all this brush fuel that then starts a fire that burns down, a huge portion of a city. And so I think and I put in the chat a link that goes to a tweet I had that goes to a YouTube of Stephen Pine, a fire historian, who gives an amazing talk to the Long Now Foundation. But he talks about sick biotas. Like we're doing these like things to try and fix fire, like prescribed burns, but what we don't realize is that the ecosystem is just unhealthy. If we thought about how to make the ecosystem healthy, maybe that's some prescribed burns, maybe that's some mechanical thinning, maybe that's some reintroduction of species, maybe, some restoration. Like, how do you think about that? And I think that becomes the challenge for us, for policymakers, for others, is how do you design kind of environmental standards or prescriptions or other things and get people to want some of those things to happen near their home that allow for the ecosystem to be healthy so their house doesn't burn down. And people are confronted with these things all the time. And it's kind of like making clear how all these things intersect and interact. And maybe that's part of it, is like, it's just gotten so complex. It's hard for anybody to fully wrap their head around. It's all black and white type work. But really here, it's about what makes an ecosystem function, what makes a society function, how does our relationship to nature function so that we can keep kind of progressing as a species in ways that support us and support the natural environment. So that's what I have to say on the topic. But any last thoughts from anybody else before we say goodnight?
I just want to thank you, Grant, for putting it together, for getting us all here. That's really, really fun and interesting, and I'm glad I was able to read it.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
so glad.
Thanks for hosting, and thanks everybody for the conversation. And had you not done this, I would not have read it, and it was phenomenal.
Same.
Part of it was like, I just want more people to know about this book. It's so good. You guys got to read it. Like, I want to talk to Brendan about it and my friends and, do these things. So I'm so glad you all enjoyed it. That's music to my ears, and that you had a good time with it. And then, it's thought provoking, right? Like he asked questions that are not easy to answer, and are really kind of fun to think about. So that's it for today. Just a couple like logistical things going forward. If this was fun and you're interested, I'm doing one on what I think is a similar topic, but is slightly different. I don't know if you can see right back here, but that top book is The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt on Tuesday. we're going to be reading the first half of that. We're talking about the first half of that book. It's about 450 pages in the first half, and then 450 pages we'll do in the second half. Brendan, get reading. But that's one of my favorite books of all time. But I picked it because to me it asks a lot of similar questions to Aldo Leopold's, like how do we live? Like what does it mean? What do we owe each other? How do you what is our civic duty and how do we really think about that? And they're operating in similar times, and so there's a lot of overlap between their ideas and the history and other things that are happening here. It won't be as environmentally focused. It'll be just kind of a broader conversation. Cover a lot of New York politics and history as well. But if you're interested to do that, and then if you got other recommendations of like what you want to do again, what next books? Like I got a whole host of environmental books I'm working my way through and writing about, like I said, on my Substack at grantmulligan.com. You should follow Robert's Substack. It's amazing. Bird history. It's very, very good. Go listen to his old episode on odd lots. It's very good. But just like, thank
I
you
would
all
like to eat a robin is my takeaway from Robert's Substack. The forbidden meats.
I'm sure we can arrange that. Technically illegal, but I'm sure we can arrange it. We got robins for days over here. But anyway, thank you all so much. It was a true pleasure, and we'll see you next time.
Later, guys.
Yeah, nice meeting you.
Thanks, Grant. This is
Later.
fantastic.